Coming up, it is cut down day for the New York Football Giants, and we take a look at any surprising names that found themselves out of a job, at least for the short term, trying to project who's going to make it through the practice squad. And of course, looking around the NFL for other key cut candidates that could help Big Blue build up their depth chart. We dive into it all live on YouTube coming up next. Yes, my friends. It's OGP, the One Giant Podcast, where you know that I'm your host, Adam Armbrecht. Andrew Makowitz along shortly. Then when he gets here, we'll both be healthy, wealthy, and wise, talking about the New York Football Giants, obviously cutting down to what has to only be called the current 53-man roster. So we'll go through, recap the players that were already let go prior to today. I think we had a 12 more up until last night. And then coming in this morning, you start to get these waves coming through. Technically, the Giants haven't announced anything official. This is all per reporting from a lot of the guys that are usually around the team, Jordan Renan, Dan Duggan, right? So all the typical sources coming in with a lot of this. And we'll see what it means for the Giants as all the other cuts happen. And then we get into the claim process that'll wrap up tomorrow at 12 p.m. So 4 p.m. deadline. At that point, we should hear something official come out as it'll need to be submitted. And we'll go ahead and fire that off as well. When Andy gets through some of the interesting names that ended up, not making it for the New York Football Giants, practice squad, the wide receiver room really ended up coming out here in terms of cuts. We knew that there were positional debates that were happening, but it turns out that a lot of guys aren't here. And always easy to look back and read the tea leaves on it. Probably should have looked at that group a little bit differently, although there was a lot of reporting about where value was on a player like Boykins or the head-to-head competition in veteran Allen Robinson and Isaiah Hodgins. So we'll get into kind of all the nitty-gritty details of it. But there is one other thing here that I thought while we wait for Andy, we would dive into, and welcome everybody in over on YouTube as well. Is there anybody that you saw when we talk about the New York Giants and the cuts that have come through that you're surprised by? Are there cut candidates that have come off of other rosters now? And remember, the Giants have that sixth waiver claim position, so they can start to make those moves. But Pat Leonard had reported, and this is what a lot of the reporters around the team are doing now too, who's on the practice field or not on the practice field. So there was this one recent note that I did find interesting. And just from the standpoint of, should anyone care, not care? Should we be concerned, not concerned? So originally it was posted that Tommy DeVito was requested today by the media, but was not made available to anyone. So that comes from Pat Leonard. And the speculation there would be, if there's guys that aren't being made available, ultimately there are guys that could be cut or released. Now, we went into the discussion, the talking points about our initial 53 and saying, I don't know where the concern level is around losing a player like Tommy DeVito. He's been a nice project. He's been a developmental player that Brian Daboll and the staff have done a nice job with. Are you concerned about not having him be a part of your core going forward? And at this moment, we also saw, because there's a couple of teams on the league that have to make hard choices about their QB rooms. The Cleveland Browns are keeping everybody, as of right now, 4 quarterbacks in their room. They brought in Jameis Winston this offseason. They also have, obviously, a player up top on their roster that's been waiting to kind of come back from his injury and look like the player that he once was. But then they also have 2 more quarterbacks in their room right now. And it's interesting to think about. I'll pull up their 53-man roster as it stands right now. And it certainly is interesting to think about what they're trying to accomplish. Originally, the idea was that they brought in, obviously, Jameis Winston to be the backup, but now there's some speculation that maybe they would be interested in taking offers for Jameis Winston and then riding with their other 2 backups, one of which is Tyler Huntley, formerly of the Baltimore Ravens, and a player that I said, if the Giants were looking to bring in another name, this is going back earlier in the summer, before we're talking about Drew Lock being brought in, hey, this would be someone to look at. So currently they have Deshaun Watson, at the top, obviously, Jameis Winston, Tyler Huntley, and then Dorian Thompson-Robinson, who got some sample size last year. Certainly was a fun watch for a little bit of time. At first, it looked like, well, maybe you keep an eye on that roster and you say Tyler Huntley, Dorian Thompson-Robinson. I don't know where the value would lie there. Put him on the practice squad. Tyler Huntley's had real reps at the NFL level. And I kept going back to him. But now that you hear it's Jameis Winston, and some people suggesting, well, with the state of the Giants room and the depth, should they go and give a call and see what a trade with Cleveland would look like? I still come back to, specifically when it comes to the QB room, and I understand some of this is perceptually about what you want to accomplish in the upcoming season. If the agenda is that we believe we've improved the offensive line and we've gotten Malik Neighbors and we feel like we have improved enough in key positions on this roster that we're going to go out and compete this year to be a team that wants to be 500, wants to be above 500 in the 17-game season, then I think safeguarding against something like injuries matters. But I keep coming back to this idea. One, that whether or not you prefer Drew Lock be the backup, he's the backup. Like the Giants paid him guaranteed money to be the backup. So I think all this speculation about specifically a backup quarterback that you would have in here seems at best, mildly interesting, but mostly fodder when it comes to what the Giants are going to do. And that brings us back to Tommy DeVito. And really specifically, whether you want to talk about Tyler Huntley, I don't think he would be let go of. It'd probably be Dorian Thompson Robinson, or maybe it's Jameis Winston that's going to get traded out of that room. Something's going to happen here in Cleveland, and it's going to happen for other teams too. Whether you like Bailey Zappi or not, he was let go because New England restructured themselves. And just at the QB room level, again, I'll reiterate that my belief was the Giants should have looked at the draft. I don't think we talk about opportunity to move up. Sure. Could you have taken a player like Bo Nix, who's now starting, looks like gearing up towards starting for the Denver Broncos? Of course. But you didn't do that. You went with the weapon. That's fine. But to not maybe look in those later rounds, and I had earmarked Joe Milton as being someone worth taking a flyer on, to not go and look at a player like that, I think it makes it a lot harder for me to have this conversation about a need to carry 3 quarterbacks on the active roster. Or again, a concern around losing a player like Tommy DeVito if you had to cut him and try to get him through the practice squad. So on a high level, that's just interesting because I think from an inside perspective, this happens at every position, but the concern level around losing a player like Tommy DeVito is more indicative of how I think the fan base feels about not only Daniel Jones, but also Drew Lock. But the reality is, at this moment, if Daniel Jones doesn't play well to start the year, we know it's going to be an issue. If Drew Lock comes into relief, we don't know what expectations we should set for him, really. Flashed a bit, right, in relief there in Seattle, but we don't know what to expect there. The season hangs in the balance on a lot of different things. And unfortunately, if the QB room turns out to not work out, that's what it's going to be. That being the case, there's another one here actually too. Great job, El Scorcho, coming in here with another quarterback that was on the move, and that is going to be Malik Willis, who goes from being one time thought potentially could be the starter to the backup to being traded. So he goes from Tennessee to the Packers. And if you're talking about a 7th rounder for Malik Willis, again, he falls into that category too. When we think about what he showcased for you, now here's probably the problem with a player like this. The fact that he's being traded typically is going to tell you that this is not a guy that if he goes to waivers is going to make it through. So you can't just wait for that to pass and then go ahead and make a different decision. The other part of it would be, I don't know where his contract stood given where he was drafted, 3rd round pick. I have to take a look at the numbers. The other part of it is if you go ahead and claim these guys, then the money stays active. If they get through waivers and then you just sign them, then you reset what the cap hit is going to look like. So when we talk about Malik Neighbors going back over these last 2 seasons, listen, he played in 8 games in 2022, only 61 passing attempts, 50% completion percentage, and he only threw 5 passes a year ago, right? So again, would I have taken a look at a player like him? Maybe. But I also don't think that he's somebody that you had to. Comes out of a small school, Liberty. He might just as well fall into the same category as a Tommy DeVito. There's a certain mold of player that I would never go as far as giving up draft capital to go get, but I would always be aware of on the waiver wire and saying, hey, if we believe that this player can do something for us, let's try to be active on it. Let's go ahead and take a look here again. Oh, another name here. Now we're talking about a guy that I don't mind. Let's stay on the QB trend here until Andy joins us, and then we'll back ourselves out to the cuts, what's been going on for the Giants and what we can expect for them as they work their way through today and then into the claim period, which, as I mentioned, is going to come up at 12 p.m. tomorrow. So we are 5 minutes away from the official. end of the 53-man cutdown. So we'll start to get the finalized version of things as well. Derek Grant mentions Desmond Ritter is a good option. Don't you agree? Listen, I like Desmond Ritter coming out of Cincinnati. I was a fan of his. Now, when you're not watching him every single day, as Atlanta was, you can certainly make the decision about whether or not his developmental track was ever going to fully get there for you. I do like, if I was going to take a flyer on somebody, I like taking a flyer on a player that when you look back now after 2 years in the league, started 4 games, played 4, started 4 in 2022, and then played in 15, started 13 in 2023. The completion percentage is good, 63.5, and then up over 64%. Like, let's just take 2023 where the sample size is large enough. Completed, again, 249, like had almost 400 passing reps. Touchdown percentage doubled up there to 3.1%. He split it even money, 12 up, 12 down in terms of touchdowns and interceptions. So, I mean, there are things there to me, and an 86.4 and then an 83.4 in terms of rating. And here's the big difference, though. Some things where you saw improvements in year number 2, the area you didn't see it was 40.1 QBR, a big drop off from a limited sample size in his rookie season. And that's a part of the problem. Now, again, 2 fourth quarter comebacks, 4 game winning drives. Sometimes, especially when you're talking about a player who was taken in the 3rd round and an organization that feels like, well, we got a lot of weapons on this team. And we know they do, right? They're completely stacked. We need a guy that's going to get us there now. And then you ask the questions about how they went about it, bringing in a veteran, then also drafting a young quarterback, and maybe he's going to start now. All of those things are certainly questions for Atlanta, but they are an offense ready to put up a ton of points, and you need that now. You can't wait for that or for the potential development. So they had to have a quick thought about Desmond Ritter. I personally, he might be a guy that I would take a flyer on in the quarterback room for the New York Giants. I'll put it this way. The potential of a Desmond Ritter, and by the way, age is a factor here because regardless of what you think about him as a player, Tommy DeVito is 26, 27 years old. You're talking about Desmond Ritter will be 24, 25 years old. Like, yeah, I would take a look at a player like that because if I think I have to keep a 3rd quarterback on the active roster on the New York Football Giants, and I'm going to keep a guy that if he gets into a game, well, there's a world where he can win some ball games for us. He's at least shown himself to be capable of that. And if the season agenda is we want to make sure that we're competitive, we want to start to show that this thing is turning around the right direction, I'm going to take chances on guys I think it can get us there. Now, obviously, you could say last year Tommy DeVito led this team to some wins, but I just think there are limitations in his game, as we know, that would prevent you from, even as we saw last year, when you are winning football games, still saying, yeah, but what are we really doing here? What are really the expectations? So that's a good name to remind everybody about, someone that I did like coming out of Cincinnati. And then obviously things turn quickly for him down there in Atlanta. It's also true that it does not matter. Like, QB is not really the issue here. In the grand scheme of things, you have to look at this at a high level as an organization coming into the 3rd year for Joe Schoen and Brian Daboll that needs to show that the core of this team has taken a step forward, that the base that you want to drop in future QBX into is ready to win. So when we talk about all these positional battles and guys that have come and gone, listen, we can start to just highlight this at a basic level. The cornerback room obviously has questions to be answered. Part of that is because you didn't bring in anyone outside of Drew Phillips, who's going to be playing in the slot for you this season. And then you also put a lot of emphasis on the potential of Cordell Flott moving outside. But then unfortunately, because of injuries, we didn't get any kind of sample size there. And we'll get into a lot of the cuts that came out of this. And Trey Herndon was among them. David Long Jr. is among them. So they cleared out a lot of bodies there, which makes you assume that they're going to be going to market for that. That's a problem. The depth on this roster is going to be interesting on the defensive side. While we expect Dexter Lawrence and Kayvon Thibodeau and Bobby Okereke and Brian Burns, these guys are all going to play big reps, but you are going to need a breather. And to some extent, you can say it's less of a concern there, but they still held on to both Jordan Riley and DJ Davidson, at least for the moment, from what we know. And that's interesting, mostly because what am I relying on here in that department? And then you get all the way back, obviously, the safety room. That, I think, was a little bit easier for the Giants to make difficult decisions. OGP favorite, Alex Johnson. He ends up looking like he's going to be one on the cut list here. We'll see if he makes it through to the practice squad, depending on how waiver claims go. But a little bit easier because you have Pinnock established. You drafted Tyler Newman, obviously, and you still have Dane Belton, that they seem to have some belief in expanding it a little bit more. So you can look at this team on the one hand and say, well, at the high level starters, like we got some nice core pieces here. The problem is that for the defensive front that looks very strong at the starter level, the secondary is ambiguous. On the offensive side, just like with Cordell Flott defensively, by the way, you like the fact that you go out and you sign these veterans. We assume that you can set a baseline for what Jon Runyan Jr. is going to be for this team. It's unfortunate that he hasn't been in camp healthy and able to have some reps. He's projected to be ready going towards the regular season. That's awesome. But it doesn't get us all the way across the line right now. It still has us watching reps from an Aaron Stinney, right? Looking at a guy like Kubas and saying, oh, maybe he could flash something here, right? So for every spot that you think we feel pretty strong about, you also have to flip the script and say, there are these holes that we need to address. That being the case, we're going to, when we come back here, bring in Andrew Makowitz and start to talk about all of the cuts that have happened here, any of the surprises that we saw, and there should be a finalized version, at least, of what is the, again, quote unquote, current 53-man roster as we have just crested over the 4 p.m. hour. So coming back in, let's break down the current 53, talk about the guys we wish were here, talk about guys we hope make it to the practice squad, and also the areas that this team clearly needs to continue to address as other teams cut down to 53 as well. Back in just one moment. Oh, and now we welcome in Mr. Andrew Makowitz. How are you, sir? I always at the top, don't even need to tell me. You're healthy, you're wealthy, you're wise. You're excited to be talking about the 53-man roster. I just spent, maybe we'll touch back on a little bit later, a big chunk at the top of the show talking about QBs and the QB room, and some people still voicing concerns about losing Tommy DeVito. So let's put a pin in that part of it for now and just get into where we currently stand on the 53-man roster and another 15 or so cuts that came through pretty early this morning.
Yeah, well, the first thing I wanted to say at a high level is obviously
Really
when we
cooking
go
right now.
through the cut downs, Adam, we all value our own players more than other teams do. You're like, you can't put this guy out to waivers because he's going to get claimed. And,
Yeah.
I fall, prey to that as well, knowing guys like Turbo Miller, who I have liked all preseason. You kind of look at it and you say, well, he's the fourth string on the Giants. How many other teams have 4 guys that they like that have been through camp that they've worked that they can't keep all 4 of their running backs? And all of a sudden you start thinking to yourself, okay, like a lot of these guys are fringe guys making the Giants roster, and we are a very thin roster, to be honest with you. How many other teams even have the ability to claim some of these players? So as I saw some of the names coming in, and I was like, oh man, I wish, Turbo Miller is just one that comes to my mind that would still be on there. It gives you a chance to pause and say, everyone's dealing with this around the league. How many claims are actually going to be made? It's probably not as many as you think.
Yeah, I mean, I think from a Giants standpoint, I agree with you. And the Dante Miller one is a good example because you don't have to be the 4th best running back on another team. You got to be the 3rd best running back on another team in order for someone to come take you, right? And really be willing to sacrifice a spot like that. Again, you and I have gone back and forth this a bit. I do have my concerns about the state of this roster overall and just saying, like, there's still a lot of questions here. And I don't know if any claims are going to solve them. We've already heard some names get thrown out. We mentioned this yesterday. Hey, don't forget, Titans, ties to Shane Bowen defensively. When you hear people throw out cornerbacks that are getting cut, and then you go look how they grade out and you look at their sample size, to your point, it's like, well, are we now going to overvalue connections to the defensive coordinator for players that maybe weren't even starting or weren't playing even 20% of the defensive reps a year ago? So swapping out like for like is still going to leave you with more questions than answers. And I think sometimes ambiguity can often be disguised as, oh, excitement. Hey, we brought in this guy. Let's see what he can do. Then you'll find yourself saying, oh, right, just like some other players that weren't here. So let's run through. Dan Duggan had put this up here, and then we'll continue to get into everybody's comments as well over live on YouTube. I got bad news, guys. There's a mosquito inside the studio, and he is coming after me pretty vicious right now. But we're going to power through because that's the way that we work it. I'm struggling. Dan Duggan had the original 53-man roster look based on what he could see, and then including practice where some guys were out on the field, some guys got taken off. So as it stood right now, and I mentioned at the top, it's Jones, Drew Lock, and Tommy DeVito for the moment. Running back room, as you say, Singletary, Tyrone Tracy Jr., Eric Gray, that seemed to be coming into focus as we moved along. First big surprise is getting to the wide receiver room. Malik Neighbors, Jalen Hyatt, Wan'Dale Robinson, Darius Slayton. That all makes sense. Then injured Gunner, who has not been out there and practicing, but performed very well last year. He gets the spot. And then, man, my pick from a couple weeks ago, the initial 53, Bryce Ford Wheaton seemingly got himself through on this roster spot. And boy, did we get, I think, a little bit we got a little bit led astray here by the way this team was covering a player like Boykins and saying, when you want special teams value, this is where you got to go. Not only is he end up as a cut here, so does McKenzie end up as a cut here, it looks like, as he was not on the practice field as well. And then you can even go into what was supposed to be a head-to-head battle for a roster spot. Veteran Allen Robinson, Isaiah Hodgins, they both get cut as well. And would you agree that really what we got led astray about, I think I allowed myself to be, is, hey, it's the top 4 guys that really matter. Like, they now have a number 1 wide receiver. They have 3 other players that they believe in, and everybody else is a little bit of fodder, special teams value, but that doesn't really matter when we're talking about the overall success of this team. Maybe we're debating those guys a bit more than we needed to.
Yeah, I think we maybe put too much importance on them being like a key contributor at the wide receiver group. And I know that sounds kind of crazy because they are in the wide receiver group, but it's like, what flexibility do these players present for the Giants that maybe allows them to think about other rooms a little bit differently? And so, you look at Isaiah Hodgins. Are there other teams that are going to put a claim on him? Maybe. Do they need that depth? He's not an explosive type player. He's not huge. He doesn't have the athleticism, but he was a good player and a good contributor for the Giants. Allen Robinson obviously was here for a little bit as a veteran, had over 1,000 yards, 4 seasons ago. He just couldn't break into it. Bryce Ford, you and I both had heard many people say Miles Boykin was going to make this roster as a special teams player. And when you hear that, it means that I deprioritize Bryce Ford Wheaton, because while he does have special teams value, you already are assigning Miles Boykin that special teams value in the wide receiver room. So to me, it was a little bit of a surprise on how all of this ended up coming to be, knowing what we had heard like over the last, 3 weeks from a lot of people very close to the team.
Yeah, 100%. And as we talk about the new look of this roster and what it's going to mean and how this team is going to shape itself out, the Bryce Ford Wheaton talking point, as Andy will be right back in with us, is a fascinating one, mostly because one of the players that we talk about, maybe we'll get through the practice squad, that's Isaiah Hodgins, right? 7 touchdowns over the last 2 years for this team, has obviously had some value, showed up big in the game against the Minnesota Vikings 2 playoffs ago, and that's fantastic. So you want to think, and they gave him some money too, some guaranteed dollars. So you want to think that he would be someone who would make it. So then when he doesn't, you kind of say, okay, maybe not loyalty lost, but just, hey, we're looking to improve this roster. Boykins is a new player, some holdovers. Bryce Ford Wheaton has struggled to stay healthy. But then what I came back to, and this was mentioned by Art Stapleton, was the Giants like the upside of a Bryce Ford Wheaton. Like, they like what he can be for them if he can be on the field and if he can be healthy. So then when you think about it in totality, we have our top 4 guys in the wide receiver room. We'll talk about special teams fits here a little bit based on what we've seen so far from who's projected for the 53. You have to then start prioritizing maybe the idea of who's a guy, though, that if he gets on the field in the wide receiver group, has that potential, has that upside for us that we can get excited about. Bring back Andy in here just because he's looking to have a good time with us as well. So ultimately, in the end, some big cuts coming out of that wide receiver room. Maybe interesting because the Giants, it has been mentioned, even with Gunner, still in the market for potentially a returner. So you can think about guys that offer that kind of value as we talk about cut candidates. And then we move ourselves, Andy, on down the line into the tight end room. This, not really surprising. Stoll got cut here. It really was mentioned, but just not enough time probably in camp for him to make an impression, even if he could have. So it's Bellinger, it's Johnson. It's going to stay with Manhertz. They also let go. I'll put in fullback tight end in Jakob Johnson as well. Are you surprised they didn't keep Johnson up there? Because I just think this is another one of those ones where you drafted Theo Johnson. You and I consistently said, I don't know why people are debating Daniel Bellinger. And then Manhertz is really the only other guy that showed up and had consistent reps over the course of camp. I was just a little disappointed in some of his blocking reps when it came to preseason.
Yeah, so this doesn't surprise me at all. Jakob Johnson, people are also freaking out because they're like, wow, he was only here for 2 weeks, but he made an impact. Why are they letting him go? Adam, he is a vested veteran, which means you have at least 4 years of service in the NFL. And what that means is you are not subject to waivers. So the Giants could very simply go to Jakob Johnson and say, we'd like you to be around here. Do you want to be here? Do we kind of have a gentleman's agreement that, like, we need that roster spot for a little bit of roster flexibility? We got to put some people on IR. We may have to make a claim here or there, but we want you back on this roster. There's a very good likelihood that that's what happened with Jakob Johnson. Not that I don't have any inside knowledge, but the fact that he is a vested veteran, he was signed 2 weeks ago. Every other team had the ability to sign Jakob Johnson for the last 6 months if they really wanted to and did not. So for me, it feels like this is kind of an operational procedural move. And I wouldn't be surprised if Jakob Johnson ends up back on the 53-man roster, 36 hours from now, once the Giants have figured out what they go from their initial 53 to what potentially could be their real 53.
Yeah, and that's going to align with like who's out there to be claimed, right? Where do they want to maybe spend some of their 6th overall position when it comes to the waiver claim? How do they want to work through this process to improve this roster? So another name certainly to keep an eye on there. We work our way then down into the offensive line room where they do stick with 10 right now. And I at this moment, I'd have to speculate they're keeping an eye on what happens around the league as well. But it is obviously Thomas Runyon, John Michael Schmitz, Greg Van Roten, and Jermaine Illuminor, along with Aaron Stinney, Evan Neal, Joshua Zudu, Austin Schlottman, and then Jake Kubis. So, like I said, have I been overwhelmed by the very small sample size from Evan Neal? Of course not. Zudu hasn't exactly shown up to be a stud in the backup category, but Kubis making it through at least for the moment. It goes back to something we had mentioned a few episodes ago of the Giants want to take on Joe Schoen's mentality of doesn't matter where we find the guys, the best guys deserve the opportunity. And Kubis had shown consistency over preseason. So for the moment, he makes it through and the Giants carry 10 offensive linemen.
I am surprised. The one surprise that I had here, Adam, that I had noted down was Austin Schlottman. Like, he hasn't really played all that well. And Kubit, most people might say,
oh, well, Morrissey, by the way, who had played well for a bit, but then fell down the depth chart in terms of reps at the center position.
Yeah, I'm just surprised that Schlottman made it because his play on the field so far, even in preseason games, hasn't been great. You highlighted the notion of Jake Kubis sticking around just because while he is a developmental prospect, he does have some intriguing traits and like he has some really good size. I think he's a guy that the Giants may think can have a spot to contribute at some point over the next 2 years, not necessarily immediately. But I look at Schlottman as one of those guys that if someone gets claimed in the secondary, which we'll talk about, if someone gets claimed somewhere else, he's someone that I think is probably towards the back end of the 53 right now. I wouldn't get too cozy if I were him on the initial 53-man roster.
Jalen Mayfield was also let go there inside of the offensive line room. He was one of the guys that I kind of earmarked, but that was the debatable one when we talk about keeping Evan Neal or letting him go. So, yeah, fluid, I think, at best here. One other note on a quick pause, because we're basically ready to switch ourselves over to the defensive side of the football now. But a reminder, and I was listening in a little bit with Paul Dottino as he does the Big Blue Live earlier in the day. A reminder that the Giants do have 2 retractable IR positions, everybody does, that do not go against the 53-man roster. So effectively, you can maintain 55 guys, and then you open up that window 4 weeks, and then you have 21 days, and then you got to make choices about what you're going to do with them. And I'm certain they could label a couple of players in that vein. And just one quick footnote, Lawrence Cager was officially let go of out the door as well in this whole process. It was speculative IR, what's it going to look like? Interesting to see what happens with him just because athletic, obviously a weapon for any room, let alone the New York Football Giants. Defensively, Danny, I was going to call you Danny, and I'm mixing you
Danny
up.
Boy, all right, I'll take you for today. Why not?
Danny Duggan. Not that I.
Oh, you wish
Dan wants to come on the show. I have to make
yourself
room for
deeper,
him.
Adam. You're like Danny. Oh wait, no, Andy. Oh, I meant Dan. I wish Dan Duggan was my. Well, I mean, anything else you want to say while we're in the trust tree?
I'm enjoying. I think it's been a good show so far, so I'm going to leave it at that. Dexter Lawrence, obviously. Nunez Roche, obviously. This was a little surprising, I think, to both of us, whether we debate which way it was. Both DJ Davidson and Jordan Riley make it. Obviously, Elijah Chapman had shown up in camp and preseason enough where he was deserving of a spot across the defensive front. Are you surprised that both DJ Davidson and Jordan Riley, for the moment, have made it through on the 53?
No, because as you mentioned in the moment, I think I keep saying
Until
the
something better
initial
comes
53.
along, you gotta have somebody there.
Some people are calling it the initial 53 versus the real 53, but like, I don't know, however you want to describe it, the initial
Yeah.
team that made the 53, seeing DJ Davidson there, obviously he spent a little time on the practice squad back and forth. He's probably a guy on the short list that if waiver claims come in, maybe they would reallocate those and move him potentially to the practice squad. So I'm not really that surprised. I have always thought that Jordan Riley has a role in this team, especially knowing how thin they've gotten with Ashawn Robinson and Leonard Williams and others leaving the organization over the last 12 months. I feel like Jordan Riley is the guy that they really want to kind of take that role on moving forward. So, not necessarily surprised. Was there anything that surprised you?
No. I mean, I guess because they're both kind of in that age range where they just feel like depending on who else is out there, and we'll talk about at the back end of this. What are the first handful of names that you would earmark to say if someone becomes available? These are the first guys that you'll see step down, and then of course among these cut candidates, who are guys that we want to see get through to the practice squad. No, again, the depth of this team is thin. So even guys that you consider, I mean, remember, we're about to get into the linebacker room. I'll tell you right now, Timon Fox got cut. This is a guy that was playing significant reps a year ago. We didn't come into this offseason thinking that he had a roster spot, but that's an indication of, well, we improved enough and we bumped down people in the pecking order that now Timon Fox becomes a good story from a year ago, but now we need to go ahead and improve. And that just feels indicative of a lot of these positions, especially on the defensive side of the ball. So when we talk about outside linebacker first here, Brian Burns, Kayvon Thibodeaux, Azeez Ojulari, maybe that surprises you, and maybe you're thinking they're still going to try to work the phones. Boogie Basham, and then Benton Whitley makes it through here on the initial 53, which I think is really good. And this actually, in some ways, might be the Timon Fox of this season is, hey, a guy that showed up deserves to get rewarded, and he, for right now, remains on that 53.
I think it's important to note, Pistol Pete, listen, credit where credit's due. I have felt for the entire summer that Azeez Ojulari was not going to be making this 53-man roster. And what I will say is I was wrong, because it seems like he has made this 53-man roster.
Yeah.
However, let's just make sure that everyone understands over the last 10 to 12 days that everyone close to the team talked about how Azeez Ojulari was a potential trade candidate. Multiple beat writers were the ones saying it. So it wasn't out of thin air that this guy was necessarily not going to be long for this roster. And listen, to your point, Adam, we said the rules of the game are week one, if he's on the roster, then Andy was completely wrong. There's still
got time. You still got a little bit of time.
There's so you're telling me there's a chance. That's kind of
Yeah,
what I'm
right.
saying is, let's wait and see. They did keep Benton Whitley, which I mentioned before, which is an interesting one to me. I've liked the way that he's been running with his hair on fire during camp. It is a tough day seeing Azeez Ojulari on there. Apparently, he is, at least for now, part of the initial 53-man roster.
Yeah, and I don't think it's a bad thing. And as we say too, we've seen some other teams have made some trades, is swapping some picks and players. I mean, the Giants made one of those with Phillips as well early in the offseason. Saw a former captain for the Rams, or the linebacker position, getting sent out. I mean, so things are happening in the background, and I do wonder at a high level for Joe Schoen if it's, yes, if we could get X for Azeez Ojulari, we would make that move. We would try to improve this team elsewhere. But we also do value him in the short term this season at a certain level, right? Has starting experience. He's now going to be a backup. So it's not like they're sitting here saying like, oh, this dead asset, can we just get him out of here? And this has often been the debate that we've had around, say, Evan Neal, who is, again, had injuries, and we want him to try to improve and develop. But at a certain point, you do look and go, well, if I can't see him to say something, right? So there's that balance there. And I think that that's probably a part of the equation as well. One other note here. Well, first of all, one other note here from Pistol. Pistol, get in here, man. Thank you very much for coming in here. Close enough, Crow Eaton. Well, if you're gonna throw up a little bit of super our way, yeah, you're gonna go ahead and get highlighted. And hey, listen, that's all you want to see, right? We at a minimum give you intellectual honesty around people we thought were going to make the team, people we thought were going to get cut, and whether or not we ultimately have to say, yeah, we were wrong on that player. It's what makes me the most disappointed about waffling on Bryce Ford Wheaton, because I had him and then I waffled. So
Adam, you had it.
Credit.
What you need to do is you need to pull the old Skip Bayless, where like credit to me originally for figuring this out. I was right the first time.
Yeah.
I should never question myself, because I'm I am
Never
so
quit.
good at prognosticating. Shame on me for questioning me because I was right the whole time. That's the way
Never
you should.
question your own greatness. And that's
Yeah.
something that I keep telling myself, and it always comes back to bite me when I don't listen to me, which is just such a great resource to have for myself. Anyway, inside linebacker, let's talk about it. Bobby Okereke, Micah McFadden. Here's some good ones, though. Deontay Johnson had the injury, but has made his way through. Certainly wonder if they'll manipulate that as far as they're going to return, depending on the level of the injury. But he showed enough for them to want to keep him around for now. We thought that Carter Coughlin was in line as an experienced player, special teams contributor, and then because of the injuries around him as well. And then you get Muasau making it through now, plus Matthew Adams, who I had maybe passing through the practice squad. I believe you had him on your initial 53. How many of these guys in this room are we looking at and saying, okay, but let's see who shakes free here? Because there's a lot of special teams value and then rookie value, developmental value, but I wouldn't say we're bullish on the depth behind Bobby Okereke and Micah McFadden.
Well, we were told Miles Boykin and Matt Adams were definitely making the roster, both for their special teams prowess. And it seems like, if I'm reading the tea leaves correctly, they saw enough from Bryce Ford Wheaton in his special teams value that they said we don't necessarily need to keep Miles Boykin. However, with Matt Adams, they haven't seen an alternative to what he brings in terms of special teams. They did guarantee him some money. He has, people say that he is a leader, so I'm not necessarily surprised by that. What I will say is, obviously, they just drafted Darius Muasau, so he is someone that is intriguing. I feel like the Giants don't necessarily know what they're going to do with him yet. Like he comes in there, he's not prototypical. He's not going to be your every down inside linebacker that's going to be like a Bobby Okereke in training. Like, that's just not how they're going to deploy him. I am very curious to see how the Giants intend to use him, where they're going to use him, because he just doesn't fit the same as a lot of the other players in this linebacking room.
No, 100%. But at least at a baseline right now, some special teams value. And then the Deontay Johnson one is so fascinating, right?
I love it.
Because it was just enough of a sample size to like flash and get you excited, and then not enough more to confirm and say, oh man, like we think he can be X or Y. Well, CJ Cloyd, he didn't make it through here inside of this group. That's okay. Hope he makes it to the practice squad roster. He flashed a bit. Go ahead. What'd you have?
No, I was just going to say on Deontay Johnson, we were going back and forth a little bit on Twitter about like, hey, look at some potential players that worked with Shane Bowen in the Tennessee Titans. It's easy to connect the dots. And there were some comments about like, that is very overrated. No one really cares whether or not they've been with them or there's the system. And Deontay Johnson is the prime example of why it does matter, Adam, because under Wink Martindale, he was a practice squad player that couldn't find his way onto the field because Wink Martindale cares about blitzing, all-out blitzes, pure athleticism, where Shane Bowen's kind of quarters defense prides itself on being a smart football player, putting yourself in the right positions, being in the right zone. And Deontay Johnson played that exact scheme at the University of Toledo, which made him an all-conference type of player. And so when you look at it and say, you're all-conference in this scheme, you come to the NFL and you're a practice squad player in a new scheme, but then he starts to look good in training camp under Shane Bowen. Schemes matter. They do. It's why, if someone can ever figure out in their scheme what Isaiah Simmons should be, like, man, what a home run they could hit because of his athleticism. The Giants clearly saw enough from Deontay Johnson, even after getting hurt and having limited snaps, to say, what we saw in this new scheme works for us. And it works enough where we want to make sure that we protect him on the 53-man roster.
No, for sure. And that's when we bring ourselves to the cornerback room. Deonte Banks, obviously, Nick McLeod, who has been around this team. And every time you think someone else is going to start, he ends up being the guy that has to step up and fill in. Drew Phillips, the rookie, obviously. And then Cordell Flott, Isaiah Simmons, and Trey Hawkins. Listen, on the surface here, this room is funky because Cordell Flott was supposed to be the guy on the outside. The injuries have kept him off the field. So if you look right now on the Giants, using any number of outlets, but if you look at the initial 53-man roster, you'd have to assume coming into week one, it's going to be Nick McLeod playing over top as currently constructed over top of Cordell Flott and his opportunity to reclaim that role for himself. It's just so disappointing that he wasn't able to play in preseason, because one way or the other, it would have been nice to see what he looks like on the outside, playing with some of these weapons that the Lions had, the Texans had, right? Those first two games, especially with the weapons that they have on the outside. So now you have this question mark there. And then even Trey Hawkins, he can be a preseason darling. He can show you some things in camp, but we know how difficult it was for him a year ago. he is at least like the big body inside of that cornerback room. So for the moment, this is who we have, and you hope that some of these guys can continue to develop along the way. But this is clearly the position with the most question marks on the initial 53.
Well, yeah, this is the position where you should expect something to happen for the Giants, because I think everyone agrees that this is an issue for the Giants and they cannot go into week one the way it is constructed. I don't know how to nicely put it. Like, I'm excited for the players that made the initial roster. They obviously have worked hard through preseason, but even in the joint practices and in the games, it is definitely the weakness of this team is the cornerback. It is, we got to figure out how we're going to play Isaiah Simmons. I'm not convinced that he's going to be able to be this nickel corner that they keep talking about. We saw what happened in the Texans game against a guy like John Mechie Jr., who's an actual wide receiver, where he just can't stay with these guys that are so agile. You'd like to see Drew Phillips get healthy, and he's probably going to reclaim the role, especially on rundowns where he can get down into the box and really, use his physicality to his advantage. It feels like there's at least one claim, if not two claims, that could potentially happen in the cornerback room, or signing a guy after he makes it through claims, however you want to decide it.
Yeah.
I had mentioned Caleb Farley as a guy from the Tennessee Titans who has been through quite a bit with injuries and other things, with his family passing and not being able to get on the field last year. He's someone that at least has that first round type pedigree that the Giants have familiarity with Shane Bowen. I think it's a natural connect the dots, because right now this room definitely needs some extra help going into week one.
Yeah, and that's my biggest question right now when it comes to the cornerback room is are any of these cut candidates going to be the answer for them? Or are they going to have to find a way, whether we hear about a trade, whether we see them try to scour the current free agent market class, or again, we talk about initial 53. It's also the initial 53 for a lot of teams out there. So maybe there's another cut coming here along the way where someone has to take a chance. But for the most part, it does feel like if you're going to claim a guy from the names we've seen around, I think there was one from the Tampa Bay Bucks that we were intrigued about too. Long, lean player that got cut yesterday. These are going to be flyers, right? I mean, it's coming to camp. And guess what, though? That's not a terrible thing, at least in the short term. If they walk in the door, and let's say it's Trey Hawkins, they walk in the door and over a week of practice, they bump Trey Hawkins off the depth chart, fine. Like, that is what it is. And maybe Trey Hawkins will be the guy that is out in order to bring that player in. I think you have to just be willing to keep turning it over until you feel like incrementally you're elevating the talent level that you have there, even if we have to acknowledge it's just going to kind of be the sum of the parts in the secondary, because in this moment, I don't see the player getting claimed or brought in right now that the fan base is going to go, oh, there we go. Finally, we addressed the cornerback 2 position, barring a trade of some kind. And I just don't know if that's the path that the Giants want to take. Let's finish off this secondary and this defensive side of the football before we take some high-level talking points. And again, everybody in over on YouTube Live, really appreciate it as we roll here on a Tuesday afternoon. It was going to be Pinnock, Nubin, Belton. Nothing really surprising here from those three. Gervarius Owens, unfortunately, because of the injury and noted by Dan Duggan, he was on the field and participated in stretches and individual drills, but then walked inside with 2 staffers early in practice. That's usually indicative, as we know, getting towards the cut down time. And then, obviously, one of my favorites, Alex Johnson. He does not make the initial 53. He'd be one of the first guys I'd say, man, I hope he makes it through to the practice squad, obviously. It's interesting, as uncertain as we are about the cornerback room, both Gervarius Owens and Alex Johnson, I would say, well, I'd like to have these guys make it through the practice squad because I think they've shown positive signs of good development.
Yeah, I mean, listen, this is a business, but it does feel awkward to see Gervarius Owens walk out with the rest.
The worst. Yeah.
Listen, the practice started at 2 and they have until 4:00 to do all the cut downs. So the NFL doesn't do a good job, or the Giants didn't do a good job setting the practice time. Where maybe you just have him coincide. I don't know if you felt that was uncomfortable, but how do you have him go out there and have him have the mindset or the perception that he has made the roster? And we're assuming that he got taken by 2 staff members inside to be able to say, you're not potentially on this 53. It doesn't really make sense to me, but also seeing Alex Johnson not make the initial one, potentially Gervarius Owens, we haven't gotten word yet on that.
Yeah.
The Giants only have 3 safeties on the roster right now. if they're only carrying 3 right now, they absolutely have to put a claim in on someone. And, just in Lewis Cine from the first round draft pick of only like a year and a half ago of the Minnesota Vikings, already released by the Vikings as part of the 53. He's a guy that the Giants could claim if you're talking about high draft pick, high potential pedigree. But Adam, I mean, it's surprising. The Giants clearly can't go into the season with 3. That would be the number one priority outside of cornerback is safety, I guess.
No. For the Giants?
I mean, you can't go into the season in week 1 and only have 3 safeties on your roster. That to me feels like you're just asking for an issue to happen. Like you got to have enough.
Yeah, but I can't put that as like the number. I can't put that as like the number 2 priority. Like you need to add another body there. But that body doesn't need to be of a certain caliber. It just needs to be someone, hey, we think they can develop. We think they have an opportunity. They're the 4th guy on the field. You know what I mean? Worst case scenario, when you're running 3 safety sets and you have all 3 of those guys out there, okay, great. If one of them were to go down, you maybe would have a veteran on the roster, like a Jalen Mills, who you paid and then cut earlier this summer. But I mean, I get your point about it being something that you're going to need to address potentially. I guess I would just look at it and say, right now,
I can guarantee that there will be one transaction for a safety before week 1.
That's fine. Yeah, I'm not. But no, I just meant. All I meant was.
I'm
really
agreeing.
Care about.
I'm
who
agreeing
they
with
in.
you on that.
Yeah.
What I meant to say was like they will have to address it, and me saying a priority as in like they have to do something, regardless if it's a small move or a big move. The cornerback room, we're all saying they definitely have to do something, but they have enough bodies to theoretically not let anyone go in the cornerback room and go in with that cornerback group. But you and I both.
Yeah, you know what? Actually, I'll push back on that actually, because worst case scenario, let's assume that Javarius Owens and Alex Johnson, or one or the other, gets to the practice squad. There's another safety. If they like these players and they value them like at a high level, let's say, and the number crunch or the injuries just prevented them, well, they're there. So in a worst case scenario on a game day, you go in with 3 safeties and one goes down. I mean, listen, 2 safeties go down in a game, obviously it's a real problem. But in the event that one went down, you're going to have somebody on your practice squad ready to call up for the very next week. If you believe that there's a guy out there that's a contributor of X level, then that's a different talking point, I think, a little bit. But at a certain point, I have to prioritize what my needs are on the waiver wire, what my needs are before we get to the roster, and say, I don't really care about getting a 4th safety just in case right now. I care about, are we totally comfortable with our swing tackle situation? Like cornerback 2 is the number 1 priority right now, unless they're telling us that they believe in Nick McLeod and then eventually Cordell Flott, and then that's going to be the process. Fine. Or Trey Hawkins, which we don't think is the case. And we're pulling for any one of them, by the way, especially guys that were draft picks. If that's the case, okay, fine. But then the very next one has to be, where do we stand on our backup swing tackle? Where do we stand on our offensive line? And who is getting cut that we believe is capable of contributing in that role? Because right now, while we've seen Ezeudu play, Evan Neal just got back on the field. I have accepted the idea that maybe if the Giants are keeping him and want to get the most out of him, it may just be you're going to be a backup across the offensive line. You'll be on the interior because you're too stiff and can't be quick enough to cover those speed rushers around the edge. At that point, we don't necessarily know who our backup is there in that position. And I know you'd probably maybe make a similar case to me. Well, if Thomas goes down, come on, what are we talking about? But you still want to feel like you have confidence in the players behind them right now. And that's certainly an area of question as we wait to see how things go on claims.
Yeah, I mean, listen, if Andrew Thomas goes down, we're in a whole world of hurt. He's one of the few players that just cannot go down under any circumstance. What I have seen in the chat as we're thinking about this roster, we have people bringing up the name, conjuring up Adoree Jackson, because there is that need in the cornerback room. There seems to be some mixed messaging from someone suggesting Adoree Jackson. Where are you if the Giants, would you prefer they put in a claim on someone younger or potentially often injured? Like, obviously, these guys are getting released from another team for a reason. Would you rather them go down that route or go the veteran route and bring back someone like Adoree Jackson?
No. I mean, Adoree Jackson, I mean, the only weird thing I'll say about this is, because I heard something, they're talking about the Eagles, like, that at one point Bradbury, like there's just fluidity around veteran players and the cost and maybe moving on. So it's like former Giants, right? But the only thing in Adoree Jackson's corner is that there was something funky going on when they weren't sure where they were going to play him. Then they tried to stick him and it didn't work out. And then Trey Hawkins, suffered a little bit. And was Wink Martindale not the right system or not adaptable? XYZ. He's not young. I think that if the Giants brought him in, maybe specifically, you would see him suffer at the same reasons that he suffered a year ago. The rest of the secondary isn't strong enough for his kind of diminishing, skill set to still hold value. And if he still does have a baseline of value, I think he's just waiting to see what happens with everybody in cuts and someone needing a cornerback and saying, great, can I get 7 million? Can I get 8 million? Like, what is it going to look like? That's what I think he's holding out for, which probably precludes the Giants from being in those waters. But in that vein, you brought up a handful of guys here that on other teams that have been let go with familiar rings, like the Eagles, I mentioned, John Ross, Nick Gates, Paris Campbell. The Bucks, Sterling Shepard. The Jags, Gary Brightwell. The Chiefs, well, I'm not going any further than mentioning his name, Kadarius Toney. These are all, though, former New York Giants. And I think we've done this in years past where guys leave, they go to other teams. They had roles with us. They go to other teams, and they just become cap casualties or cut candidates pretty much, in quick order, relatively speaking. And it always comes back to, where's the strength of our roster? Where is our depth at? Oftentimes our starters or number twos end up becoming fours and then cuts, which is always reminds you, I think, of where this roster still is sometimes.
Yeah, that is the fascinating part. You look at Paris Campbell and Sterling Shepard were two of our wide receivers last year, right? And they can't even make another 53-man roster to start. You look at a guy like Gary Brightwell was a special teams contributor, got a handful of snaps. As you mentioned, we don't even need to talk about the smart, tough, dependable Kadarius Toney. The Eagles getting rid of John Ross, Nick Gates, and as we mentioned, Paris Campbell, just fascinating. Like this just highlights the depth of the New York Giants.
Of course,
some of these players were guys on the 53-man roster. Some of them were contributors over the last 2 seasons. And when we look at it now, they can't even break onto another roster, never mind be a key contributor there. It just shows how far away the Giants are from being a team that people around the league would turn around and say, man, the Giants have tough decisions here because if they get rid of one of these guys, we're surely going to be claiming them. That's not just a position the Giants roster is in right now.
And one little note here coming in from Dave, he said, I like Allen Robinson as the vet presence. You were talking about a guy like Johnson, understanding with accrued time, they can go ahead and bypass the claim process and just say, hey, do you want to be here? The Giants can say that for him. Sterling Shepard with the Bucks, while yes, he was being cut, most people are saying for now, as he'd like to get onto their practice squad and still be with the team. Happy for him in any capacity if he wants to continue his playing career. I don't know what to make of some of these cut players out of that group, because we can probably tie a bow on in that regard. I'm going to highlight a couple of start comments here before we do. Just, hey, where do we stand? Only a couple of things of note here is, again, I'll just say, Lewis, when you bring up trading for a cornerback 2 and a backup offensive tackle or a swing tackle, these aren't bad ideas, but what's the price point? And I mean price point in terms of to go and trade for them. And then also, what's their salary? What's their cap hit going to be? The Giants don't have limitless money in that regard. I don't know. I don't know how you're going to trade for a number 2 corner right now in this market. Most teams, I'll put it this way. If you're trading for a player, what you're going to be talking about is somebody's like high-end 3 that you maybe think can be a number 2 for you. Because most teams that have a number 2 aren't just offering them up for trade. So we'll see how that plays itself out. And the only other one is a good note here from JB. Players get cut for a reason. You rarely get a diamond in the rough players on waivers, which is true. The only difference here, the only caveat, is that the Giants always need to improve their depth. So it's not even about diamonds in the rough. It's just about players that are baseline better and maybe some veterans that have 2, 3, 4 years experience at this point.
Well, so Adam, I have a question for you on the cornerback room specifically, because I think this is a question that's probably in a lot of Giant fans' minds, and I want to know where you stand on it. There's 2 different routes you can go here. You can go the veteran presence route of a guy that's probably maybe past his prime, but he plugs the hole. He fills the void in CB2. He's not going to be the worst player on the roster, but he's certainly not going to be someone that excels. Or you can go the younger route, someone with flaws, try to develop them, but know you're going to have these bumps and bruises along the way in the hopes that they can contribute to this organization long-term. And so I think it's a philosophical question to you is, should the Giants be looking for just a veteran body on the outside in hopes of competing this year and giving themselves the best chance to compete like day 1, week 1? Or should they be thinking about, how do we develop more talent across this roster? How do we get younger and figure out which players are going to be here for the longer term build that we have?
Yeah, I will revert it back to what was said on Hard Knocks in the offseason. If we get you Brian Burns, Shane Bowen, that's all you get, and you don't get upset. So that was the indication of we know how restrictive it's going to make it for us. Now, whether or not they thought that Cordell Flott would flash, or they thought they would have some established hierarchy, that's TBD. But I unless you're doing a bad job GMing, Joe Shane, you have to know that once you commit that money to Brian Burns, you understand what it's going to mean to make other decisions. So I think, and I don't mind it, you go into the season, you say, hey, Tay Banks, take that next step, of course, and then we're going to continue. Cordell Flott, can you develop and can you grow? Listen, Trey Hawkins is a deep cut, but can you stick around? Can you provide better than, almost perfect ratings to opposing QBs? Like, you're going to test those waters. And I think it's better to clear the deck of some of those guys. That'll come with its own criticism about draft allocation, especially with Cordell Flott. But if that's the case, I'd rather know that this year, where we think the Giants are going to try to be better, probably aren't going to be getting talked too much about for the playoff run late in the season, but then at least you'll know clearly what you need to go and address in next year's draft class, next year's free agency class. So go through the guys you have, rotate players throughout the year, grab guys off of other teams' practice squads, right? Like, keep making those choices and just try to flesh it out, because you can't solve every hole that this roster has before this season starts this year.
Yeah, I agree with you. I
Thank
think
you.
you look at it and you say, are we developing Trey Hawkins? Are we developing Cordell Flott? Are we developing Drew Phillips? We already
Sure.
have Deontay Banks. Is he going to emerge as a bona fide cornerback number one? It does feel like we already have a lot of guys that we're looking to build to the future for. We might just need a stabilizing force in the cornerback room that you're like, okay, at least they can give us like just above replacement level value to be able to like shore things up on the side. But it's going to be interesting to see what they do. Remember that the waiver claims go in. The Giants have the 6th waiver claim, Adam. So
Yep.
until about week 4, it goes by how you finished last season in terms of where you can put in your waiver claims. You and I both hypothesize that the Giants are going to have at least 1, if not 2, waiver claims in for potential players, and we should get those announcements sometime around this time tomorrow afternoon.
Yeah, noon is the cutoff for putting in your waiver claim. So tomorrow morning we'll come in, we'll talk about who are some of those speculated players. We'll probably get some drips and drabs about it as well. And then by noon it'll be official. So we may play it depending on the morning. So we did this one live, obviously, depending on what the morning shows, just as a a show note. If it looks like we can wait until noon, then you'll probably see us closer to midday. We'll go ahead and break it all down so we have a clearer sense. And then the practice squad will also start to unfold as well. So we'll get some of those indications too. So that'll be a part of our programming note for what we'll be doing tomorrow, and then going as we work our way through the week and talking about, are there trades available? What are some teams offering up for teams to come in and bid on as well? I'll run through quickly here. Just this quick little thread, because Dr. Pancake, a frequent flyer with us, we could literally let go of any cornerback outside of Banks and Newman and replace them with guys off the waiver wire without losing skill. That could very well be true, although you mentioned Newman. He's in the safety room. Then you're talking about Pinnock. I think Belton to a lesser extent. I could debate that. However, this follow-up of add Drew Phillips to the list, I just don't understand what we're talking about here. He's a rookie player that they brought in. Now, you want to tell me you could take a guy off the scrap heap of another team and improve on his play? That's TBD, certainly at best. And this is a good final note from Dr. Pancakes. Using Ojulari, which has always been Andy's this has always been the process, is it's not just, get rid of him. It's try to turn him into something else. And maybe this is the way that you get there. Looking at other teams that are deep at cornerback, maybe want a little more depth in their edge rushing room, and they see Ojulari as, hey, 1-year flyer, that's worth the value. And maybe the Giants get a Band-Aid likewise on an expiring contract too.
I couldn't agree more, Adam. Sorry, I thought you were.
No,
I thought you were finishing up
your dramatic pause. When somebody
I,
crushes a point like that, you want to just let it.
I was like, I couldn't agree more. I mean, he said trade Ojulari for a cornerback help. I'm like, that's what I've been saying for 3 months. So like, end scene. If this was a Shakespearean play, I would just end the scene right there. But I couldn't agree. We will obviously have some updates for you as they come in. As you mentioned, Adam, if we get some in the morning, we're happy to be able to hop on with everyone and be able to do it then. It sounds like everyone's putting in their claims by 12, and then there's a few hours that the NFL has to figure out who had what claim. And by about this time tomorrow, we will know with relative certainty what the 53-man roster is going to look like. Be in store for maybe 1 or 2 other minor tweaks before week 1 against the Vikings. But once the Giants make their claims, that is more than likely going to be the majority of the team that's going to be there on week 1.
I always disagree a little bit with this because then I think there's still a little bit of wiggle room where like because teams claim some guys, they don't claim some guys get on the practice squad. Other teams maybe want the guy at the practice squad, so they move him up off the practice squad.
You just want to be able to do mocks and hypotheticals. You love it. I'm ready to get the season started, baby. Week 1 against the Vikings.
I am. By the way, because we'll cover all of this, and then we get to turn our attention finally, and then we'll reset the table. By the way, with what we expect for this season, what we hope for this season, reasonable outcomes, expectations, all that kind of stuff. So it's going to be a lot of fun. To look at this team ahead of the season, and then we get our wheels rolling, and that's it. Live football. That's when we'll know. That's when we'll get the sample size that tells us where this team is currently at. And a lot of the pundits speculate it's not a great spot. You can go ahead and get us, as you're seeing right now, live on YouTube, doing that at least once a week, all off season and into the regular season as well. Over on your podcast feeds, please go subscribe, turn on the alerts, leave a glowing 5-star review, if you please. And we'll continue to rock and roll with this, man. Cutting down towards the 53, cutting down towards the practice squad. And then, as Andy mentioned, turning our attention, our focus to the Minnesota Vikings, the week 1, the home, the century uniforms that everybody's dying to see. And hopefully Big Blue getting this upcoming year off to a great start. But until the next time, and until the best times, with one final shout out to our guy, Pistol. Thank you very much. We appreciate you. As Andrew Makowitz would want, need, demand you the people know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.